Recently, I found out Joshua Reich is dropping off from GitHub. If you haven't heard of him, he's one of the few reasons working with Linux on Rockchip SBCs is so much easier today than it was just a few years ago. His Ubuntu Rockchip distribution is built for Ubuntu 22 and 24, and they've been maybe the most popular and stable way to run Ubuntu on Rockchip devices. So popular, in fact, that manufacturers who use Rockchip, like Turing Pi, build their own official images on top of Joshua's. Now, if you're reminded of XKCD 2347, yeah, I am too. Basically, Rockchip, a company valued in the billions of dollars, can't be bothered to help SBC makers like Turing Pi with an official Linux distribution, so Turing Pi turned to Joshua's project and actually worked with him to try to get their hardware working better with it. But from what I've heard, some other vendors, and I'm guessing a lot of individuals in the community, didn't treat Joshua with the respect that he deserves, or with financial treatment, or offer their own resources in return for the help that he gave. Sure, there are also other community distros like Armbian, but when I think back to like 5 or so years ago, before Joshua's distro and before Armbian was as mainstream, it was sometimes impossible to get Linux running stable on many Rockchip boards. They usually support older LTS Linux kernels like 5.10 now and 6.1, and their RK3588 might get support for 6.11 soon, but that's all besides the point. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the maker-taker problem in open source, specifically why Joshua is stepping away from his extremely popular distro, and why this is happening more broadly in many areas of the open source ecosystem. Because this problem with open source has only gotten worse while the stakes get higher. And just thinking back a few years, like there's been Elasticsearch who kind of changed their licensing after Amazon was taking their product and basically repackaging and selling it for a lot of money on AWS. Red Hat took CentOS and kind of changed the way it was packaged so that it was much more difficult for downstream users to use that as their server OS. Redis has changed, Redis Labs, I should say, changed Redis's license to make it harder for people to host it and sell that hosting. And those are some commercial enterprises that kind of took the thing because they saw too many people taking their product and reproductizing it and making money off of it. And recently this year, there's WordPress. It's kind of a whole debacle with Matt Mullenweg. There's even a website called Bullenweg that was set up to track all this stuff. There's a ton going on there. I'm not going to get deep into it, but it was a similar problem. There are people who make these products and the people who invest a lot of time and resources, and people who might not put as much time and resources into making, but they take from it and earn a lot of money off of it. And the thing is that in all these cases, the license is the most important part for someone who's very philosophical about open source or free software. And a lot of times these companies will change their licensing, and I think that's a pretty shady way of going about things. If you license something as free open source software with GPL or with some license that gives those freedoms to users, and you start taking away those freedoms over time, that's pretty shady. But on the flip side, most of my software is either MIT or GPL licensed, and it is still a thing where I do a lot of work to build these things, and people can take the work that I do and build a product that makes 20 times or 40 times the amount of money I'm ever going to make off of them. Is that fair? I mean, for me, I don't care that much, but for a lot of people, they do care, and a lot of people don't have the safeguards that I've built up over the years to prevent the burnout. And, that licensing side is one thing, but the open source community, I think, is even more important, the community that you foster around your projects. And my open source philosophy and my introduction to free software came out of Drupal, an open source CMS that's written in PHP. It's still very popular. It's a lot different today than it was when I found out about it back when it was version 5. The leader of Drupal, Dries Buytaert, who I've met, talked to, he's a friend. I consider him a friend of mine. He actually, I believe he's run his website. He might be running it right now off of Raspberry Pi. He's a tinkerer at heart, and he wrote Drupal, and he still is the BDFL for it, the benevolent dictator for life. And he works at a company called Acquia, and I worked there for a short time, and they are not the owners of Drupal. It's a little bit different approach than a lot of other open source software projects. Drupal is a community first. There used to be a saying, I don't know how true this is anymore because I'm not as active in that community, but it was come for the code, stay for the community. For a lot of software developers who are deep into the FOSS or open source ecosystem, it depends on where you came into it from. But for those of us in Drupal land, we came and saw this community of people working together to build up this project. and we all found ways to monetize it for our own goals. There are tons of companies that still exist that they do full-time Drupal development, and all of them are making tons of money off of it. Some of them contribute back more, some of them contribute back less. But in Drupal, that community was part of the core part of what made you someone who did Drupal stuff. And it was something that these companies, the leaders in them, were often people who were invested in that community aspect. And Drupal has, over the years, built up this idea of contributions giving a company or individuals more prominence within the community, to the point where it's incentivized through some of the tooling that they have on their infrastructure. But that's not the only reason I think that Drupal has succeeded where a lot of other projects have floundered. You have a central company that is not necessarily in control of it, Acquia, but they also do have a lot of the people that are in the project's central kind of command structure. But they all delegate that responsibility, delegate things to other companies, and there's a board, there's all these things. You know, some of the politics is annoying even when you have a project that's had a long-term successful story like Drupal, but it's worked over the years. It's different than a lot of other communities, and people create more wealth outside of just the core people who built it, and that's not a bad thing in the Drupal community. That's a good thing. And for me personally, like my own personal software philosophy has always been, if I can build something that's cool and someone else can take that and do something way cooler and way better and make tons of money off of it, that's awesome. I created more wealth in the world than I could have made personally. As long as I have food on my table, as long as I have mental health. And for me, I've built up those safeguards for preventing my burnout. And I have a YouTube channel, and I have my open source contributions. I have people sponsoring me on Patreon and GitHub. So I've built that up, and I have kind of that privileged position of being able to say that now, but throughout my whole time, I always was happy to see people build off of my stuff. I don't want people stealing things that I don't have with an open source license. That happens too. But anything that I release as open source, I'm glad when people take that and build off of it. To the point that I've even given away my Ansible for DevOps. That book single-handedly turned me into what I do today, making projects on YouTube. But you know, some of that stuff's a little bit tangential. Part of the point that I want to make today is I think that some communities, especially communities that revolve around hardware like SBCs or electronics projects or things like that, sometimes people have roadblocks to that mentality that we had in Drupal that leads to a sustainable environment of contribution and support for each other. Couple that with the fact that a lot of individuals who do this stuff, like I know I get into modes where I'm focused on something and I can get deep into a project for a whole week. And it's not really good for my revenue because some of these projects and some of these things that I try totally don't pan out. And that happens with these open source projects too. Sometimes people are kind of prone to wearing themselves out and burning themselves out, especially if you don't have a community or don't have people around you that are watching for warning signs and trying to get you out of a rut like that. And, you know, I really hope that Joshua can come back and get the financial and emotional support he needs to thrive in his development process. And maybe we can get that Ubuntu project back up and running. But I don't blame him for a second if he never comes back at all. That would be fine with me. It can be harsh, especially coming from me, who I maintain a ton of open source projects. But for my own protection, I usually come in pretty hot and heavy and I close issues. I use the Stalebot to close issues on my own projects. And if a thread gets angry or discussion gets heated, I just ignore it. It's not worth my time at that point. I wrote in 2020 on my blog, be liberal with your no and be judicious with your yes. And for me, that led from that year to now to a ton of freedom to pursue this YouTube career and also still maintain all the little open source projects that I want to use for my own good. And if other people benefit from them, that's great. If you don't like the way that I do it, fork it. But how do you prevent your own burnout in your career? I know some people watching this channel have probably been in this industry a lot longer than I have and have other techniques too. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.